Well, hello everybody, it's Matthew, your friendly neighborhood technician, and Ruby. Say hi, Ruby. Hi. So, today we are diagnosing a 2005 Toyota Highlander. It's been a little bit of a difficult diagnosis because nothing on it has really been straightforward. So, a few things we were diagnosing was a possible oil leak, kind of a thumping, thudding noise in the steering wheel when you dial it back and forth, as well as possible rotor replacement due to pulsating while driving and using the brakes, and then all in all just basically going over everything. So the steering issue was a little bit complicated diagnosis, and so was the oil leak, but let's go ahead and jump right into it and I'll show you how I figured it out. So first of all, as far as the oil leak goes, just asking some of the simple questions about the vehicle. Have you noticed significant oil loss or anything like that? The answer to that was no. And as a matter of fact, when the vehicle came in, it didn't necessarily have low oil or anything like that. However, if you go underneath and look, you can see that there's definitely some type of leak, especially if you look at the exhaust here. You can see it's been leaking on the exhaust, and the complaint was that they're seeing drops of oil on the ground at home. So, what is it that's leaking? Well, it's not the oil that's leaking. It took me just a little bit to figure that out. It's actually the transfer case transaxle. As you can see here, this is four-wheel drive, all-wheel drive vehicle. All right, so here's your transmission. It's a sideways transmission. And here's your transfer case and your transaxle as well. And so it's actually the transfer case and transaxle that is leaking. And I'll show you that here in just a second. Alright, so we've got a different view of our transfer case transaxle and also our leak here. And you can see up here where it's really wet and fresh, where the passenger side axle goes into the transaxle and the transfer case. So basically the front differential and transfer case are all built into one here. And what we have going on is inside of here there are two seals, all right? There's an inner and an outer seal, and they're back to back sitting in there basically. All right, now the outer bearing for the passenger side axle, front axle, is lubricated by transmission fluid, ATF fluid for the transmission. There's a little passageway inside of there, and that's what lubricates the outer bearing. However, everything in between here in the transfer case is lubricated with gear oil. And right here is where you would drain your gear oil, and here is where you would fill it back up again, or check it at, actually, okay? And so you have two oil seals in there. One that keeps ATF from leaking, and then another that keeps gear oil from leaking. And if you notice right here where my finger is, there's a weep hole right here, just like on a water pump. There's a weep hole right here, and depending upon what fluid leaks out of this weep hole is what tells you what oil seal internally is not performing anymore. So because we have axle fluid coming out, it's not ATF, because we have axle fluid coming out, and what it's doing is it's coming out of the weep hole here and it's leaking down and it's getting all over everything, everywhere, okay? And so you can see it's leaking down around here, it leaks all up through here, comes through here. And I've got this plate off because I did want to make sure and double check that I wasn't dealing with a rear main seal leaking. I'm not. It's dry as a bone inside of there. So it leaks. It runs along the engine here. And then it also drips off onto the exhaust. And it's all coming from the weep hole here. Alright, so it is an internal seal. And as you can see, to get this pan off, to get this side off of this transaxle or the front cover off, there's no room. So in order to fix this leak, the transaxle, the front differential and transaxle transfer case needs to come out, and it needs to come apart, and that little $6 oil seal needs to be replaced in there. And so this is a common thing on the Toyota Highlander, also the RAV4, and then I also believe the Lexus RX. I've seen this issue on a Lexus RX before also, so this is the first Toyota Highlander I've seen it on. But it is a common thing. That's because Toyota used a cheap oil seal in there. So the only downside is to get that transfer case separate from the transmission, you have to pull the engine and the transmission together as one, or what Toyota will tell you to do per the factory manual is to drop the engine cradle. So that's to drop the subframe with the engine and all that still attached to it. You drop that out, and then what you do is you lift the body up. So that way all you have is a front subframe and an engine cradle. So you need a body lift to do that. That's 20 hours worth of labor to replace a $6 oil seal. So that's where we are ultimately leaking oil from. It's not oil, it's a front gear lube, and it's due to a bad oil seal in the transfer case. So let's go ahead and start moving forward then. Let's get some focus back. So while diagnosing that leak, I found that the power steering pump is leaking. And so as you can see it here. So there you go. So what is it that's leaking on the power steering pump? Well, there is an O-ring where the return and pressure line connect, but that's not what's leaking. It's leaking from behind the pulley, which means the O-ring internally is leaking. So it's definitely time for a new power steering pump in order to fix that. And you can actually see right here where some of that is leaked off. The other thing that I checked was if the power steering fluid was low, and it was just a dash low at the minimum amount for cold. So it has been leaking, and there's really not much to it. Cost effective. If your power steering pump is leaking and you have the money, go ahead and replace both the power steering pump and the return lines. Here's your power steering fluid. Now I do have it up at an angle, but if you were to level it out, you can see that our fluid, that's just a stain. Our fluid is actually right about where my finger is, which is below the minimum line. So when you level the vehicle back out, you'll notice, and you'll just look at it and see, oh yeah, it is definitely low. So it's wise just to go ahead and, along with the power steering pump, just go ahead and replace the pressure and return lines, and then that way your power steering system has been replaced, you're good to go, and you know you won't have to mess with it for a while. So that covers the front differential leak. That covers a power steering pump leak that I found. So to fix that, I'd say let's install a new power steering pump along with 2 lines. But again, that's also up to the owner. So what does that leave us now? That was difficult to diagnose. The steering issue. And the camera may not even pick it up. But basically, if you turn the steering wheel back and forth, okay, right there, and it travels with it. See, the steering wheel keeps turning. There's just a minor hang-up in it, basically. And you can kind of hear it. Now, at first sound, and yesterday when they dropped off, I actually thought and felt like it's hanging up in here. But you got to remember, the steering wheel is connected to the steering column, the rack and pinion, inner and outer tie rod ends. So it could be anything along that route. So what I did was I had my wife sit in here, dial this back and forth with the wheels off while I inspected everything underneath there. And what I found is that the rack and pinion is actually starting to go out. It's got a hang up in it, and I'll show that to you here in just a second. Now then, as far as the steering goes and the rack and pinion go, it took me a little bit to figure that one out, and basically I just had to process of elimination, look at everything all together, and then I had to have a helper get in there and turn it back and forth. And what I found was I isolated the noise actually down to the passenger side. You can go ahead and start turning it. You may not be able to hear it on the camera. It's very slight. Anyway, so after looking at everything, watching the struts turn, watching the tie rod ends turn, the ball joint and all that other stuff, I finally just reached my hand in here, and you can feel it in the rack and pinion as it's turning back and forth. You can feel it catching inside of there. And so more than likely what's happened is internally inside of the rack and pinion, that's starting to go out because of the power steering leak, and there not being adequate power steering fluid in there. So to eliminate that noise, to eliminate that feeling in the steering wheel, it's going to be time for a new rack and pinion. So along with the power steering pump, the return line, the pressure line, go ahead and also replace the rack and pinion. That'll get rid of this leak, and it'll also fix the issue and complaint with the steering wheel. In order to fix the issue and complaint with the oil leak, again, it's not oil, it's gear oil. It's coming out of the transfer case transaxle weep hole there because the inner seal has failed. That's a big job. So what Toyota says needs to happen is everything you see from this side to the other side, including the engine, struts need to be disconnected, suspension disconnected, engine, everything disconnected. And then what you do is you actually take the body and you lift the body up and off of the engine cradle. That's how Toyota says you need to go ahead and remove that transfer case in order to fix it internally. There is a TSB out there that says you can cut the mount bolts off with a hacksaw that mount the transaxle or transfer case to the engine, but I'm not one that's all for cutting corners like that. So that's a big job I think a shop's going to have to handle. I can definitely handle replacing the rack and pinion, power steering pump, and the power steering lines. Now the final issue is with vibration and pulsating when the owner hits the brakes. Just looking at these and feeling them, there's a pretty decent lip right here, and there's a pretty decent lip here. Rotors look a little worn. Plus, if you mic them, if you mic it here, if you mic it here, and you mic it here, you get different readings on that. So that's a good indication that they're warped. The question that I have here, that I've always have, and it's really a matter of opinion, but what I normally try to tell people to do is don't turn your rotors. The rotors are cheap enough. They're like $50 for a rotor, plus installation and all that other stuff. You might as well go ahead and buy a new one when it gets to this point. I mean, I can get them turned for like $25 in town, but again, after you spent the time, after you've already paid for the labor to have it pulled off and put back on, if you turn your rotor, you're basically just getting a used rotor. If you're going to pay that money to have a professional do it, I always feel like you should just go ahead and replace a rotor. That way you've got a warranty. You can even find some rotors with lifetime warranties, so if they warp, you just go ahead and give them back and get some new ones. I've done that a few times. So either turn or replace the rotors, but cost effective in the long run, I always suggest replacing them. So go ahead and do that. And then if you notice the control arm bushings here, now I've seen them worse. I've seen them where this was just completely worn away, but when they start cracking like this and getting brittle and hard, that's when you want to start considering replacing your control arm. And that could also be working with the rotors here to cause vibration and pulsating while stopping. This right here is also something else that can cause that. So, and it's like that on both sides. So rack and pinion, power steering pump with new lines, new rotors, and new lower control arms. And that'll put, and along with the lower control arms, you'll get new bushings and ball joints and all that other stuff. So just to make it cost effective, go ahead and change all that out all at once and get it done. So, all right, folks. Well, that pretty much wraps up the diagnosis on this. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can go over with you. On some of these models, the drive shaft is serviceable. It's not the drive shaft that's serviceable, it's actually the U-joints that you can service. But how do you tell if they're serviceable or not? They'll have what's known as a Zerk fitting on them, where you can put a grease gun up to them and re-grease the U-joints as part of the drive shaft there. So this does not have a serviceable drive shaft. So those U-joints are non-serviceable. So when they start to go out, or when that carrier bearing there starts to go out, you'll know it. You'll definitely feel it all throughout the vehicle. But yeah, some of them are serviceable, and you can lube them. Some of them aren't. And again, these ones aren't. So I was asked to lube the drive shaft, but there's nothing there to do. Oh. So there you go, folks. Front diff, transaxle, transfer case is leaking due to an internal oil seal failure. That's proven by the fluid that's coming out and where it's coming out of, which is the weep hole. Along with diagnosing that, I found that the power steering pump is leaking from behind the pulley, where the seal for the O-ring for the shaft would be. So that's an internal thing. And to make it cost effective, might as well go ahead and replace the return line and the pressure line along with the power steering pump all at once. And then as far as the noise and resistance in the steering wheel, found that to be an internal issue with the rack and pinion. So in order to eliminate that, go ahead and replace the rack and pinion. There's quite a bit to diagnose and look over, but I'm very confident that that's what this vehicle needs to get it all figured out. So I'll go ahead and end this video. I appreciate everybody coming out and hanging out with me, watching my videos. I appreciate your support. If you have any questions about diagnosing your own vehicle, shoot them to me in the comments. You can also send me an email. You can find that in the information on YouTube. I kind of do enjoy trading emails with you guys, and then also sometimes I've been known to trade phone numbers and walk people through procedures and just kind of, put our heads together and help you figure out maybe a difficult diagnosis or something like that. All right, everybody. Well, once again, I appreciate your support. Thanks for coming out and watching me. This is Matthew, your friendly neighborhood technician. I am signing off.